The wind howled through the shattered remains of the colony outpost, carrying the acrid scent of burning metal. Alan Parker moved cautiously, his boots crunching against broken glass and charred debris. His pulse pounded in his ears, fingers gripping his rifle, though he doubted there was anything left to fight. A distress beacon had drawn him here. The planet, designated RX-9, was supposed to be uninhabited except for a small research team studying the ecosystem. But when he arrived, the place was in ruins. No bodies, no sign of struggle, just destruction, like something had torn through it with terrifying precision. He was about to turn back when a faint noise made him freeze. A whimper. His breath caught. Alan swept his flashlight across the ruins, past the smoldering wreckage and twisted beams. Then he saw her. Huddled in the shadows, trembling, was a girl. Not human. Her skin was an unnatural shade of pale violet, streaked with dirt and dried blood. Silver-white hair fell messily over her shoulders, and her wide, luminous eyes, almost glowing in the darkness, locked onto his. She was dressed in the tattered remains of what might have been a uniform, clutching her arms around herself like she was fighting off some unbearable pain. Alan lowered his weapon. "Hey, you okay?" His voice was low, careful. She flinched, curling in on herself as if his words physically hurt. He could see the sharp rise and fall of her chest, the way she shook violently, her breathing ragged. She was starving. No, thirsty. That's when he saw them. Two sharp fangs protruded slightly from her lips as they parted, her breath hitching. Alan had seen a lot of strange things in his time as a deep space ranger, but this? This was new. "Easy," he said, stepping closer. "I'm not gonna hurt you." Her eyes darted to his throat. She whimpered again, and for the first time, he saw something besides fear in her expression. Shame. She was fighting it. Alan exhaled. He knew what he had to do. Reaching up, he pulled down the collar of his jacket, exposing his neck. Her eyes widened in shock. "I don't know how your kind works," he admitted, his voice steady. "But you look like you're dying. And I'm not about to let that happen." She let out a strangled gasp, shaking her head violently. "No," she rasped, her voice hoarse and weak. "I can't." Alan smirked. "You can. And you will." She stared at him, eyes flickering between hunger and horror, before her trembling fingers curled into the fabric of his sleeve. Then, with a broken sob, she lunged. The bite. Alan tensed as the girl's fangs pierced his skin. There was pain, sharp and quick, but it faded almost immediately, replaced by something unexpected. A strange warmth spread through him, a numbing sensation that wasn't entirely unpleasant. His heartbeat slowed, his breath shallow but steady. She clung to him, trembling, as she drank. Alan had seen hunger before, seen men on the edge of starvation, the way they devoured food like it was the only thing anchoring them to life. This was the same. Desperate. Frantic. But careful. She wasn't just feeding. She was trying not to hurt him. Her fingers tightened against his arm, as if she expected him to shove her away at any moment. But Alan didn't move. He stayed still, watching her silver-white hair fall over her face as she pressed against his throat. Her body, once shivering with weakness, slowly steadied. The seconds stretched on. Then, finally, she pulled away. Alan staggered slightly, bracing himself against the remains of a collapsed wall. His legs felt light, his head slightly dizzy, but he stayed upright. The girl stared at him, lips parted, breath ragged. Her eyes, those glowing, inhuman eyes, shimmered with something unreadable. "Why?" she whispered. Alan wiped his neck, feeling a faint warmth where her fangs had been. The wound was already closing, some kind of natural healing agent in her bite, maybe? He shrugged. "You needed it." She looked away, her expression tight. "I could have killed you," she murmured. Yeah, Alan admitted, cracking a small smile. But you didn't. Silence stretched between them. She still looked weak, but no longer on the verge of collapse. Her breathing had steadied, and there was more color, if that was even possible, returning to her alien skin. Who are you? Alan finally asked. She hesitated, then spoke softly. My name is Ligia. Ligia. It didn't sound entirely unfamiliar. He'd seen names like that in some of the files on the frontier colonies, references to an unknown species. Some called them nocturnals or wraiths. There were theories, but no confirmed reports. No one had ever gotten close enough to know if the rumors were true. Until now. Alan let out a breath. All right, Ligia. Mind telling me what the hell happened here? Her hands clenched into fists. They came, she whispered. The ones who did this. They attacked the outpost, took the others. I tried to stop them, but... Her voice broke. Alan frowned. Others? You mean? My people. Alan's grip on his rifle tightened. So there had been more of her kind here. If that was true, then whoever attacked the colony wasn't just after humans, they were targeting Ligia species too. That raised an even bigger question. Why? Ligia shook her head, exhaustion still evident in her posture. You shouldn't have helped me, she muttered. Alan snorted. Yeah, well, I have a bad habit of doing dumb things. She glanced at him again, and for the first time, there was something almost like amusement in her expression. Then, from the distance. A sound. A deep, guttural clicking noise, echoing through the ruins. Ligia went rigid. Alan didn't hesitate. He grabbed her wrist. Time to move. The hunters. The clicking noise grew louder. Alan didn't hesitate. He grabbed Ligia's wrist and pulled her behind the remains of a collapsed support beam. She didn't resist, her breathing shallow, body still weak from whatever she had endured before he arrived. The ruins were eerily silent except for the unnatural sound reverberating through the air. Alan had been in enough bad situations to recognize predators when he heard them. Whatever was out there wasn't just wandering. It was hunting. Ligia tensed beside him, her glowing eyes darting across the broken landscape. She knew what was coming. Alan kept his voice low. Who are they? She swallowed, her hands trembling slightly. They call themselves the Cravash, she whispered. Raiders. Slavers. Slavers. Alan clenched his jaw. Humanity had its share of enemies in deep space. Pirates, warlords, corporate-funded mercenaries, some were bad, some were worse. But slavers? They were a whole different kind of evil. The clicking sound shifted, growing closer. Alan risked a glance around the rubble. Shadows moved between the remnants of the outpost, figures shifting in the dim light. Tall, insectoid shapes with segmented armor, elongated limbs, and multi-jointed mandibles. They moved with an eerie fluidity, their clawed feet barely making a sound as they prowled through the wreckage. Their eyes, black, reflective orbs, scanned the area with practiced precision. Alan had no doubt they could smell Ligia's blood in the air. His grip on his rifle tightened. How many? Ligia closed her eyes briefly, as if focusing. 3, she whispered. No, 4. 2 are scouting. 1 is the pack leader. The last is watching from a distance. Alan arched an eyebrow. You can sense them? She hesitated. Not exactly. But I can feel their intent. The hunger. That was an answer for another time. Right now, he needed to get them out of here alive. He turned back toward her. You strong enough to run? She gave a small nod. Alan exhaled. Good. Because the moment I take the shot, we move. Ligia stiffened. You're going to fight them? Not if I can help it, Alan muttered. But if they get too close, I'm not exactly the sit quietly and die type. He adjusted his rifle's scope, lining up a shot. The Cravash closest to them was moving through the wreckage, mandibles twitching. Its sharp, multi-layered teeth clacked together as it let out a guttural hiss. Alan fired. The bullet hit dead center, right between the thing's multiple eyes. The Cravash collapsed, body twitching in the dirt. For a brief moment, there was silence. Then, the night erupted with a screech. Alan didn't need to tell Ligia to run, she was already moving. He sprinted beside her, weaving through the ruins as the remaining Cravash gave chase. Their movements were disturbingly fast, bodies gliding over the terrain like spiders crawling across a web. Alan fired behind him, forcing them to hesitate. It wouldn't last. Ligia gasped, stumbling slightly. She was still weak. Still recovering. Alan didn't stop, he grabbed her, hauling her over his shoulder in one motion. She let out a startled sound. What are you? Saving your ass, sweetheart, Alan gritted out. The ground trembled as the Cravash screeched in fury. Alan spotted a narrow passage ahead, a collapsed corridor leading to a lower section of the outpost. It was dark, partially caved in, but it was their best bet. He jumped. The two of them tumbled into the opening just as a Cravash lunged. Alan hit the ground hard, rolling to absorb the impact, keeping Ligia close as debris crashed around them. Darkness swallowed them whole. For a moment, everything was still. Then Ligia stirred against him, her voice barely above a whisper. I take it back, she murmured. You're not dumb. Alan smirked despite himself. Thanks. I try. Above them, the clicking sounds continued. The Cravash weren't giving up that easily. And Alan knew this fight was far from over. The hunger within. The air was thick with dust. Alan coughed, shaking off debris as he pushed himself up. The cavernous corridor they had fallen into stretched deeper into the ruins, the collapsed ceiling above them blocking the way back. Ligia stirred beside him, her body still weak but her breathing steady. Her fingers curled against the fabric of his jacket, as if grounding herself in the moment. Alan turned his head, listening. The Cravash were still above them. He could hear their chittering, their clawed limbs scraping against stone and metal as they searched for a way down. They weren't going to let this go. He exhaled. We need to move. Ligia hesitated, her glowing eyes flickering between him and the darkness ahead. There might be more dangers below. Alan gave a dry chuckle. Yeah, well, considering what's up there, I'll take my chances. She didn't argue. Alan helped her to her feet. She was still unsteady, her body adjusting to whatever energy she had drained from him. He had expected to feel worse, but aside from some lightheadedness, he was fine. That was interesting. Most creatures that fed on others left their prey weakened. But Ligia, she had healed him, in a way. He filed that thought away for later. For now, they had bigger problems. They moved cautiously, navigating the ruined structure. Alan's flashlight flickered against the walls, revealing remnants of the colony's research station, shattered computers, overturned desks, dried blood smeared along the floors. But no bodies. Just like above. Ligia's hands curled into fists. They took them all, she murmured. Alan glanced at her. Your people. She nodded. And yours. Alan exhaled slowly. That confirmed it. The Cravash weren't just here for a raid. They were collecting people. That meant the missing colonists and Ligia's kind were still alive, for now. We'll find them, Alan said firmly. Ligia's gaze flickered toward him. She looked like she wanted to believe him. Then, suddenly, a sharp pain stabbed through her skull. She gasped, staggering. Alan caught her. Ligia? Her body trembled, her eyes squeezed shut. Her breath came in ragged bursts. Alan held her steady. Hey, talk to me. What's happening? She clutched his arm, her nails digging into his skin. I can feel them, she whispered. My people. They're close. Alan frowned. You mean physically close? Or? Ligia's eyes snapped open, glowing brighter than before. They're in pain. Alan's blood ran cold. Before he could respond, the corridor trembled. A deep, guttural growl echoed through the darkness. Alan turned, rifle raised. Something else was down here with them. The thing in the dark. The growl reverberated through the corridor, low and hungry. Alan's instincts screamed at him, predator. He raised his rifle, shifting his stance to shield Ligia behind him. His flashlight flickered as he scanned the passage ahead, the beam of light struggling against the suffocating darkness. Then, movement. A shape skittered across the floor, impossibly fast. Alan barely had time to process what he was looking at. It wasn't a cravash. It was something else entirely. Tall. Malformed. Its body was elongated, its limbs too many, joints twisted at unnatural angles. What looked like a face was stretched over a skull that didn't quite fit, its mouth split open too wide, revealing jagged rows of teeth. It let out a wet, clicking snarl. Alan swore under his breath. What the hell was that? Ligia shuddered behind him. Her breath hitched as she gripped his sleeve. No, she whispered. It's one of ours. Alan's pulse spiked. What? Ligia's glowing eyes filled with something sharp and painful. They must have tried to change them. The pieces fell into place like a gut punch. The missing captives. The experiments. The cravash weren't just capturing people, they were turning them. Alan had seen horrors before. The universe was full of them. But this? This was worse. The thing in front of him had been one of Ligia's kind once. But now, its body was twisted beyond recognition, its hunger overriding whatever mind it had left. Alan gritted his teeth. He hated what he had to do next. It lunged. Alan fired. The shot struck its shoulder, sending it stumbling back, but it didn't stop. The thing shrieked, its broken body still charging forward. Ligia moved before Alan could react. She leaped, faster than he expected, her body a blur as she sank her fangs into the creature's neck. The thing screamed. Alan barely had time to process what she was doing before he realized, she wasn't just biting it. She was draining it. The creature convulsed violently, its strength fading as Ligia's grip tightened. Her glowing eyes darkened, her breath deep and heavy as something shifted inside her. And then, the thing went limp. Alan exhaled sharply. Ligia held on for a second longer, her body still trembling. Then, slowly, she pulled back, letting the husk of what was once her own kind collapse to the ground. Alan watched her cautiously. Her silver hair was disheveled, her chest rising and falling with unsteady breaths. But she looked stronger, she swallowed hard, wiping her mouth. I had no choice, she murmured. Alan nodded, lowering his rifle. I know. But Ligia's hands curled into fists. They're changing them, she whispered. Taking what we are and twisting it. Alan's jaw tightened. The cravash weren't just slavers. They were experimenting, on both humans and her kind. He exhaled. Then we stopped them. Ligia's eyes met his, searching his face. Finally, she nodded. Alan reloaded his rifle. The real fight was just beginning. The plan. The air felt heavier now. Alan and Ligia stood over the lifeless husk of what had once been one of her own kind, silence stretching between them. Alan could feel the tension radiating from her, the weight of what she had just done settling into her bones. She had been forced to kill, to feed, from something that had once been like her. Alan had seen plenty of ugly things in his time. But this? This was worse. "We don't have much time," he said finally. Ligia exhaled, nodding. Her glowing eyes were still distant, lost in thought, but she snapped back to focus. "They'll be watching. If we move carelessly, we won't make it far." Alan studied her. "Can you still feel them? Your people?" She hesitated, then closed her eyes. A faint tremor ran through her body. "Yes." She shivered, her hands tightening into fists. "They're afraid. Weak. But they're alive." Alan's gut clenched. He had to act fast. "How many?" Ligia shook her head. "I don't know. At least a dozen. Maybe more." Alan cursed under his breath. That was too many to sneak out without a fight. He glanced down at the twisted corpse. The Cravash weren't just capturing prisoners, they were experimenting on them. Whatever process they were using, it was horrifyingly fast. If they didn't move soon, Ligia's people, and any surviving humans, would end up just like the thing they had just killed. Alan turned back to her. "Can you fight?" She hesitated. "I can move. I'm stronger than before." That wasn't a yes, but it would have to do. Alan slung his rifle over his shoulder and pulled out a small detonation charge from his gear. Ligia's eyes widened. "What is that?" "A distraction," Alan said simply. If they were going to free the prisoners, they needed an opening. Something to draw the Cravash away long enough to break in and get out. Alan turned to her. "You said you can sense them, right? The ones who are still themselves." Ligia nodded. "Good," Alan said. "That means you can lead me to them. I'll plant the charges to pull the bastards away, then we move fast and get your people out." Ligia swallowed. "And if they're too far gone?" Alan didn't hesitate. "Then we end them before they turn into one of these things." Ligia flinched at the cold certainty in his voice. But she didn't argue. She understood. She hated it, but she understood. Alan exhaled. "Let's move." They disappeared into the dark, hunting for the ones still worth saving. Blood and fire. Alan moved like a ghost through the ruins, placing charges along the most unstable structures. This had to work. The Cravash were predators, they would chase movement, they would hunt sound. If he could draw them away, even for a few minutes, it might be enough. Ligia followed close behind, her glowing eyes sharp, senses tuned to something beyond Alan's comprehension. She could feel them. The prisoners. The dying. The ones already lost. Alan saw the pain in her face. He wished he could tell her it would be okay. But they both knew that wasn't true. They reached the heart of the ruins, what was left of the research station's sublevel. The Cravash had turned it into a holding cell. Ligia sucked in a sharp breath. They were here. The room was lined with makeshift containment pods, filled with humans and nocturnals alike. Some barely moved. Others weren't moving at all. And at the center of it all stood a Cravash commander. Larger than the others. More armored, with glowing red implants running along its carapace. It held a serrated weapon in one claw, examining a struggling prisoner with an almost clinical curiosity. Alan and Ligia locked eyes. There was no time for hesitation. Alan pressed the detonator. Boom. The entire structure shook, explosions echoing above as fire and smoke erupted from the ruins. The Cravash screeched in surprise, their attention ripping away from the prisoners. The commander whirled, clicking its mandibles in alarm. That was all Alan needed. He raised his rifle. Fired. The shot took one Cravash in the skull before it could react. Ligia moved, vanishing into the shadows. A second later, another alien collapsed, its throat torn open. The prisoners stirred, weak voices rising in confusion. Alan didn't stop. He surged forward, ripping open containment locks, pulling humans and nocturnals out one by one. Some were too weak to stand, but they were alive. Then came the commander's roar. Alan barely had time to react before the massive cravash was on him, blades flashing. He dodged left. Too slow. A claw slashed across his side, tearing into his armor. Pain flared, but he stayed standing. The commander clicked something in its alien tongue, mandibles parting in a grotesque grin. It saw Alan as prey. It was wrong. Before it could strike again, Ligia lunged from behind, fangs sinking into its throat. The commander screeched, thrashing violently as she fed. Alan raised his rifle. Shot it 3 times in the head. The cravash collapsed. Ligia staggered back, panting, her eyes dark with something raw and hungry. But she wasn't lost. She met Alan's gaze. She was still herself. The building groaned, beginning to cave. Alan turned to the prisoners. Move. Now. With Ligia's help, they dragged the survivors out, racing through the collapsing ruins as the last of the explosions took their toll. By the time they emerged into the open air, the cravash were gone, either buried under the rubble or fleeing for their lives. The battle was over. But Alan knew this wasn't the end. He turned to Ligia, whose silver-white hair was streaked with dust and blood, her luminous eyes locked onto his. "What now?" she asked softly. Alan wiped sweat from his brow, glancing at the rescued prisoners. "Now." He exhaled. "We get these people home." Ligia nodded. But there was something else in her expression. A quiet understanding, this fight, it was just beginning. Alan smirked. "Something tells me you'll be sticking around." Ligia hesitated, then, for the first time, she smiled. "Something tells me you won't be able to get rid of me."